this is Rebecca Kearney, Principal Associate in the Employment, Pensions and Immigration team at Waitmans, based in Liverpool. We've got a bit of a different format for you in this Employment Insights podcast today, where I'm joined by Nick Newman, a partner in our Leeds office, Mark Landon, a partner in our London office, and Kim Farrelly, the support team coordinator, who is also based in Leeds. Nick, welcome to the Employment Insights podcast. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about what to expect from this episode?
Of course, thanks, Rebecca. So this podcast forms part of Waitmans' focus on mental health in the workplace, and we're running a variety of podcasts and other sessions that deal with a variety of different angles looking at mental health in the workplace. So some listeners might well have seen our recent panel event involving Waitmans' very own Hannah Beddis, who's a partner in the Leeds office, and a number of external experts, including a consultant psychiatrist, Dr. Keogh, and a lady called Christine Clark, a trainer for Mental Health First Aid England. So with that in mind, listeners should very much keep an eye on our website and social media in relation to other matters involving mental health in the workplace. As you mentioned, Rebecca, for today's podcast, we're joined by Mark and Kim. So I will hand over to them to give you a brief introduction.
Thanks very much, Nick. My name's Mark Landon, and as has been mentioned, I'm a partner in the employment team in the London office. I'm also actually a member of the Ethics Committee of the Faculty of Occupational Medicine and a fellow of the Royal Society of Public Health, and mental health is very much on the agenda for both of those organisations. Kim, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks very much. I'm Kim. I'm a legal secretary in the employment team based in Leeds, and I'm also a trained mental health first aider.
Thanks very much, guys. So let's kick this off then. So Mark, are you able to sort of talk us through a little bit about the legal backdrop from an employment law perspective?
Yes, indeed. I think the first thing to say is that health and safety is paramount. And of course, employers owe an obligation to provide both a safe physical and mental workplace, which may necessitate obtaining expert guidance and considering appropriate workplace adjustments for anybody who may be suffering from mental health problems. Where mental health manifests itself in things like poor attendance, performance or misconduct, then of course equality legislation may be relevant, and primarily we think of disability discrimination, but sometimes other protected characteristics might be relevant. For example, stress or anxiety resulting from race-related bullying. Also, of course, if you get to the stage where someone's employment may be in question, then the requirements of fair dismissal legislation come into play. I mean, typically the key practical considerations boil down to, does the employer have up-to-date policies and processes, and have staff been well trained to understand those processes? Do management act promptly and proactively, especially in terms of preventative action? Do management make well-informed decisions, seeking expert guidance from occupational health clinicians and others at the relevant times? Do management have regard to timely, reasonable workplace adjustments, and do they adopt a fair procedure? And ideally, it should be one in partnership with the employee. And most important of all, I think, is where an employer can create a culture of trust and confidence such that staff who are experiencing mental health issues feel confident in coming forward and saying that they need help. I mean, having spoken about the background law, Nick, what do you see happening in practice?
Thanks very much, Mark. Yeah, first of all, I would very much endorse all of what you've said. In my particular practice area of employment law, on a day-to-day basis, we have clients who seek advice on issues relating to mental health in the workplace, and indeed clients seeking advice on how best to deal with claims that they might have received, which to varying extents involve mental health in the workplace angles. So on the claims side, and in that context, I mean talking about employment tribunal claims, a significant number that we as a firm deal with will have some form of mental health angle to them. This can be issues such as claims arising from the duty to make reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act that Mark has mentioned, but also more generally, leaving aside claims for a moment, we will see a significant number of clients seeking advice for how best to deal with, for example, grievances from employees who are alleging that their employer is failing to support them in the workplace, which is sometimes going hand in hand with an assertion that that's impacting upon their mental health, or indeed, if those particular employees have particular mental health concerns, there's a question as to whether or not their employer is appropriately supporting them. So that goes back to that point about reasonable adjustments I made a moment or so ago. And the data that we have suggests that of all of the claims brought under the wider heading of disability discrimination under the Equality Act, of which there's a significant number, we think about 60% of those will involve mental health related issues. So it's a really big issue in the workplace, not only for employers, but also, of course, for employees who are in some circumstances suffering with issues in the workplace that they need the support of their employer on.
Thanks, Nick. That's a really high statistic, that 60%, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So I suppose, do any of you guys have any particular concerns about, what employers might have had to face when they're dealing with such claims?
I think in my experience, and I spent 10 years as an in-house lawyer, and it was quite apparent that managers felt much more comfortable dealing with physical health than mental health. And I do think there is a genuine concern on the part of employers about, I don't want to say the wrong thing, I don't want to make it worse. Sometimes, frankly, a fear factor, because I think when you're looking at things like depression and anxiety, I've had one or two managers say to me that their reluctance to be proactive is that it can be a little like holding up a mirror to themselves, and a lot of what they're told by the member of staff who's struggling resonates with them. And I think in the past, particularly in hierarchical organizations, there has perhaps been a sense that if you reveal you're struggling, somehow it's an indication of weakness and you're going to harm your career. And that's why I think a lot of people have kept quiet and often therefore made things worse. And I do think that's why the single most important thing is if an organization can create a culture whereby it's not seen as taboo to talk about health. And I think for those managing people with mental health issues, of course they need to go and ask for guidance and support. Why should they know how to do it? And I think making sure that they engage with HR, with external experts, so that they can make well-informed decisions about how best to support staff is really important. But you've got to start with the culture, and you've got to give people the confidence to be able to help those whom they manage who are suffering through any sort of mental health issues.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Mark. You've of course got the sort of the moral and ethical angle to this as well, and the need to ensure that the people who need support are provided with the support. And I definitely agree that perhaps there's a school of thought among some managers that might suggest that for those physical conditions, which are a little bit more easy to spot, they know the sort of support that can be provided, and therefore it's offered that much easier. It's offered in a way in which the managers just instinctively know what to do. You know, if for example, you've got somebody who has a physical condition, which means that somebody has a difficulty tackling the stairs, there's perhaps a much more obvious way in which support can be offered, whether that's through moving meeting rooms or meetings to a ground floor location, for example, or something similar. Whereas, dare I say it, I think there's a little bit of a fear of the unknown when it comes to the mental health side of things. And indeed, I think there's employers out there who know a little bit about the law, or indeed there's many who know a lot about the law. Those who perhaps don't know as much will understand that they can make certain decisions. For example, when it comes to looking at employers with less than 2 years service, they have less protection than those who have more than 2 years service, and sometimes that can bring with it some concerns or issues from the employer's side, because they feel that they can act in a way which may well not be particularly appropriate, without necessarily knowing that, for example, rights in relation to the discrimination law arise from day one, or indeed even before day one in the context of recruitment. So it can be a real difficult issue for employers to have to contend with, largely because there's a lot of stuff that they don't know, and obviously that's where the need to sometimes take expert advice from the likes of occupational health or other external professionals is really important to be alive to and highlight.
Yeah, I think the other thing, of course, is there's this thing around the social model of disability and the medical model of disability. And the modern thinking is that, in the past, if someone had trouble tackling stairs, what you did was to try and fix them or provide some equipment whereby they could use the stairs. The social model of disability says, why are you requiring them to use the stairs at all? And I think with mental health, one of the things that is sometimes highlighted is when people are suffering from stress or anxiety, perhaps through the nature of the work that they do, it's an important opportunity for an employer to step back and say, actually, is perhaps the way that we require people to work at fault? Are we creating problems? And should we step back and take a look at what it is that we do and how we do it? As always, I think with disability-related adjustments, often there is a beneficial consequential effect for non-disabled people, because what it does is to get the employer to stand back and say, actually, is there a better way of doing what we do? I mean, Kim, you are one of our mental health first aiders, and you're probably sitting there thinking, typical two partners spouting on without any experience of the coalface within their own firm. So what have you seen in terms of people coming forward and saying they're struggling, and what have you seen in terms of the practical help that can be given?
Thanks, Mark. Actually, what you've both said is actually really good points. So just to give you a little bit of a background fact, which does blend into what you two have both said, is 1 in 4 people will actually experience a mental health problem each year. And that doesn't matter where you stand in the company. You could be one of the big bosses, you could be the managing partner. It doesn't discriminate. It will affect anybody at any level. So I think by doing things like this, it makes people feel able to step forward, because 1 in 4 person may never have dealt with a mental health problem before and may not feel like they can approach somebody. Whereas if organisations are making this as well known as it should be, that mental health is treated the same as physical health, it will give that person that's never dealt with something like that before, they feel like they can step forward and they can voice what they need to voice. So actually what you've said is something that would really help employees and employers to acknowledge and be able to deal with mental health problems a little bit better, like to do with physical.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Kim, how long have you been a mental health first aider?
Oh, good question. So I think it'll be around 3-4 years.
And over that time, have you seen a different, I mean, of course, that covers COVID.
Yes.
And I think certainly, one of the positive benefits of COVID has been a greater recognition of mental well-being. But have you seen any sort of trends or changes over the last 4 years in terms of the willingness of people to seek help?
Yeah, I have massively. And I think it's because people feel more comfortable and feel less judged to talk about the mental health. And it's not just people, I know, like doctors, and they can deal with it a little bit better as well. So the people that are struggling feel like they can also go to the doctor and be able to get the help that they require.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Sorry, Nick.
It's interesting you mentioned, Mark, about COVID, because as you say, there's been a whole host of benefits that has brought to the workplace, oddly enough. But I think one of the potential, at least, downsides to it has been an increased amount of working from home, which clearly has a benefit to it in many situations, but also means that it's perhaps harder for an employer to spot when somebody's struggling, because they don't necessarily have those cues that you might ordinarily see when it comes to somebody's attendance in the office or other type of workplace. So COVID has, as I say, definitely brought some positives, but I think it's made the job of spotting potential issues that much harder as well. And therefore it really heightens the need for everybody to be alive to this issue.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. Asking someone on a Zoom call, are you all right? And they say, yes, I'm fine, is a world of difference from sitting across a desk and all the visual signs tell you they're clearly not fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Kim gave us a talk not so long ago on this topic, and she made a really good point that your natural instinct, I think, is for somebody to reply to "How are you?" with "I'm fine." That's just almost human nature, and it really does require a bit more thought to then say to them, "Are you sure?" Or "Let's go and grab a coffee and we'll have a proper catch up." If you get some of those visual cues that suggest that maybe the outward facing "I'm fine" wasn't quite the full answer.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah, I think it's the ask twice rule. So we're all human beings and we can all judge when somebody's not quite themselves. So like Nick's just said, our automatic response is, yeah, I'm fine, how are you? But you can judge when somebody's not quite themselves. So if you ask twice, that makes the person actually think, am I okay?
Yeah. And in truth, Kim, I think sometimes people ask the question, how are you? And clearly they're dreading that someone might turn around and say, actually, I'm not very good. Because, actually, that's not what I was hoping to hear. I was hoping to be able to just get on with my working day, thanks. And I think that's where training comes in. I mean, obviously these days, I tend to do a lot of training for managers and staff. And, I think it is giving people the confidence and the tools and knowing where to go for help and assistance. Because, of course, actually, it may be that it's not the immediate line manager that someone feels comfortable confiding in. And, it is having difficult conversations is not something that's just second nature for people. I think you do need training to, as you say, Kim, spot the visual signs, perhaps how to get someone to start to come out of their shell a bit. I mean, Nick, your thing about taking people for a cup of coffee. In bygone ages, I used to look after the London office, and you take partners out, partners sort of theoretically have made it. They're at the sort of the top of their game. And I would always say at the start of the cup of coffee, how are you? And they would invariably say, I'm fine. And you could bet that 45 minutes later, there were at least 2 or 3 things that were at best bugging them. And at worst, actually, it was much more serious than that. And I think it is, Kim, it's that ask twice, isn't it? It's also finding the time to have a meaningful conversation with someone. And I think sometimes taking them off site where you're not going to get interrupted and phones aren't going to ring and mobiles aren't going to go off, that you can give a bit of space to have a really valuable conversation.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because when you have somebody in the middle of an open office environment asking you if you're fine, you're pretty unlikely to be saying, actually, I'm not, in front of all of your colleagues, I would have thought. So everybody finding the opportunity to ask those questions in the right forum, adopting that sort of ask twice approach that Kim's mentioned, and giving people the space to be able to really get things off the chest if they need to is really important. And with that, of course, it's really important for various individuals, line managers, I suppose, in particular within many organizations, to understand what the cues are, make sure they're properly trained, make sure that they understand perhaps whether or not somebody's likely to be covered by the Equality Act as a disabled individual, but even then, not necessarily having in their mind that they should only provide support to somebody who's likely to be covered by the Equality Act, of course, because it may well be that it's not necessarily technically a disability issue that we're talking about. It's simply the right thing to do to provide support to colleagues who need it, and if necessary, seek some external assistance in doing that as well.
Yeah. Rebecca, I'm rather conscious of the countdown clock. Are we sort of reaching a point where we need to draw a close to things?
Yes, if that's okay. Or if there's anything, Mark, that you can just highlight by way of the types of training that we can offer, or the types of things that people could be thinking about, that would be great. Yeah,
I mean, obviously we do sort of black letter law training for managers around their legal responsibilities, and that can be health and safety, equality, unfair dismissal, etc. But we also do soft skills training around things like having difficult conversations, getting people to engage, working with external experts like occupational health clinicians, because I think there's often improvement that can be made in the interaction between management and the external support. So mental health is very much on our radar, and we're always delighted to talk to people about any sorts of training needs they may have, and just to sit down with them and see if we can then put together some bespoke training package for them.
Okay, great. That's well, thank you all. I really appreciate you all taking the time out to join us today. It's been very, very interesting from my perspective, and great to do something a little bit different. So thank you also to all of our listeners. And on the theme of mental health and specifically disability discrimination, we are going to have some future Employment Insights podcasts which delve into disability status and also reasonable adjustments. So please keep a lookout for those.